glad you joined me again for another chapter in Holy Moses. I'm sitting out on the back porch today. It's not what you'd call a beautiful day, but it's about 56 degrees, very overcast, and it could rain just any time. Who knows? Nevertheless, in the first chapter we had beginnings, and we got to meet Barton Bell and the other characters in the story. And he was quite young then. In fact, we've had a good amount of time that's passed since the last chapter. It's now 11 years later. And Barton, as a senior in high school, is involved in an awful lot of things that you would expect a good senior in high school to be involved in. So let's see how the story unfolds as we now go into chapter 2, which is titled Growing Pains. 11 years had passed in the quiet community of Brook Meadow. The oak trees in the front lawn of Brook Meadow Church were perceptibly taller and fuller. A fenced play area had been added just off the education wing of the building, and about 3 years ago, Clancy Feemster, owner of the local farm supply store, had passed away. Clancy, having no living heirs, had left money for new seating in the center section of the school football stadium, home team side only, new playground equipment at the junior high school, and last but not least, he left an endowment of money to have the parking areas of Brook Meadow Church paved with real asphalt, and not just the oil-covered caliche crushed rock that had been the surface for more years than anyone remembered. For 22 years, Clancy had lobbied the trustees and the church council to surrender the funds to make the south parking lot, that would be the lot on the main drive in front of the church, professionally paved, with yellow stripes like they have at First Church in Springville. Folks need guidance. They need suggestions on where they should be parking. Otherwise, they'll just pile into our lot like they got no good sense, or worse, like they've been drinking that morning. It ain't a good witness for our folks to be parked all pell-mell with no sense of order. For Pete's sake, what's a man got to do to get this done? Die? Well, apparently, once Clancy had so ordered it to be done in his last will and testament, upon his passing, none of the trustees nor the church council had any inclination to use the funds except in the way that Clancy had specified. Thereafter, and forevermore, church attenders would arrive on Sunday mornings and park either in the north lot, in the alley, on the west side, or in Clancy's lot, which always seemed to fill up first, particularly when it rained. Barton Bell, now 18 years of age and 2 months from graduating as a senior from Brook Meadow High School, was already late in leaving for work as a stock boy and sacker at Howard Brothers Grocers there in town. Howard Brothers was not a supermarket by any stretch of the imagination, but neither was it any longer simply a family grocery store like it had been back in the days of the Great War. It had survived the Depression and the days of ration during the Second World War, and through the 50s and 60s had actually prospered and grown with the Brook Meadow community, having expanded enough to build a larger building and employ a staff now of 15 employees. Owner and general manager Jake Howard, who was the grandson and great-nephew of the original brothers Howard, an assistant manager, 5 cashiers, 4 stock boys and sackers, 2 highly skilled butchers in the meat market, and a custodial staff of 3 who always served as maintenance workers and plumbers or electricians for whatever needed fixing or sorting. Mr. Howard had gotten onto Barton more than once for not being punctual to work. When his sack boys were late, it could happen that a customer would have no one to bag his or her groceries at a given cash register. From his elevated open office perch on the west side of the store, just above the fresh fruits and vegetables, the owner-manager would catch a glimpse of a customer having to sack their own groceries, forcing him to have to drop whatever task he was working on, rush downstairs, and sack the customer's groceries himself. Boys, if I'm going to be working as sackers as well as manage this store, tell me, why do I bother keeping any of you around? He would complain. I bet there are plenty of young men in Brook Meadow who would give an eye tooth to have your job. Don't give me the task of finding out. For reasons known only to himself this morning, Barton felt compelled to go out of his way on his way to work and pass by Brook Meadow Church, a good quarter-mile out of his normal path to Howard Brothers Grocers. Slowing, he signaled for a left turn, and after waiting for a local lawnman to drive past, Barton pulled to a stop in Clancy's lot and turned off the pickup's stumbling engine. He took a quick glance at his watch and blew out a nervous sigh. She's usually passing by here about this time, he thought to himself as he looked to the right and to the left. Not seeing his person of interest, he looked in the rearview mirror and checked his hair. Satisfied that all seemed to be in order, he exited the pickup, walked to the rear, lowered the tailgate, and taking a seat there, but shifting more than once in an effort to seem less conspicuous. Shortly, he caught sight of her. It was Megan Flowers, a 17-year-old girl he knew from school. With her being a year younger than he, Barton and Megan weren't so much classmates as they were passing acquaintances, she being a junior and he being about to graduate. They would see each other in the hallways at school, at football games, and other school functions, but had very few actual conversations. They knew who each other were, but that was about it. Their passing encounters, however, had been enough to catch Barton's eye and foster his attraction for her. To be clear, he thought she was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. Megan had blue eyes, flowing red hair, a freckled face that made her seem ready for mischief, a figure that he certainly found attractive, and a sense of maturity that gave him the impression that she was a girl of 2 to 3 years older than her actual age. Megan was walking her family dog on the sidewalk that ran across Clancy's parking lot, and unless something happened, she would pass right by without even realizing Barton was there. He had to do something, but what? He had nothing to drop or bang on the tailgate of the truck. Were he still in the cab, he would have honked the horn and waved. No such luck. Suddenly, inspiration struck him to cough, which he did, to no avail. She was almost past the midway point. Soon she would miss him altogether. He coughed once more, this time hard enough that it actually hurt his throat a bit. That did it. Megan looked his way, and after another couple of steps, she stopped walking, resulting in the puppy suddenly finding the end of the leash. "Barton? Is that you?" she asked, squinting a bit to see him clearly, even if only a short distance away. Barton sat for what seemed an eternity in his own stunned nervousness. It was actually only a second or two passing before she repeated his name. "Barton?" He'd been hoping to give the appearance that he hadn't realized she was there and turned toward her when she repeated his name. "Oh, hey, Megan." "Please, God, don't let me start stuttering again. Not now," he silently prayed. "What are you doing?" he asked, as if it wasn't obvious. "What am I doing?" giggled Megan as she replied. "Well," she added, holding up her end of the dog leash, "I'm just out giving Fritter a bit of a walk. What are you doing? Is your truck broken down?" "My truck? No, I was just on my way to work at Howard Brothers," Megan stated, interrupting Barton's reply. "Yeah, I've seen you there. My mom mentions it when you sack her groceries sometimes. What time are you supposed to be there?" "I don't have to be there till 8:30, Barton replied, pretending to glance at his watch. "Well, you know it's like 8:40 now, right?" "It is?" Barton's blood ran cold. He was going to get another lecture from Mr. Howard. He silently prayed that he wouldn't face worse consequences. "Oh, well, I guess I better head out then." And after a pause, adding, Do you need a ride anywhere? I could give you a lift as I go." Megan considered Barton's office and opened her mouth to decline just as Fritter made an orbit around her legs, effectively binding her from being able to move her feet for a moment. "Fritter, no!" She struggled to unwind the dog from her feet, but he kept eluding her hands, tightening the leash as he pulled against it. She was about to take a tumble when Barton suddenly leaped from his tailgate perch and ran to her rescue, catching her just as she began to fall backwards. "Gotcha!" he exclaimed as he caught Megan's elbows and kept her upright. For a moment, she was fully against his chest, and he could smell the fragrance of her hair. Silently, he blushed at his own touch of her arms and quickly released her, as if he'd done something wrong. With haste, he knelt down next to her so he could unwind the dog and leash from her legs and feet. No, the contact was not lost on Megan either, as she felt Barton's hands on her arms and then feeling his presence behind her as he held her up. He made quick work of her tangled predicament, and only after a moment Barton had loosened the leash from her legs and Megan was once again secure on her own feet again. She knelt down to pet the active dog, placing herself face to face with the already kneeling Barton. "Looks like you swooped in just in time, huh? Thanks. I might have squished poor little Fritter if I'd fallen on him. Sorry I made you later for work. I hope you don't get in trouble." "Nah," Barton replied, probably telling an untruth. "I'll be fine," he added, patting the little dog's head before standing. "You never did reply about needing a ride anywhere." Megan smiled and extended her hand. "No, we'd better finish our walk and get back home. Mom worries when I'm gone too long, so I'd better head back." Reflexively, Barton returned Megan's handshake as if they were first meeting. They both realized the humor as the gesture and chuckled, looking at their own hands as if something sticky had been exchanged in the act. "Well, all right then. I'll be on my way. See you later then, okay?" A warm smile rose on Megan's face and her eyes brightened more than just a bit. "Guaranteed," she said, then returning to her pet. "Come on, Fritter, let the man get going." The small black and white dog pulled forward on the leash again, attempting to exceed its bounds. Megan followed after, gave a ta-ta wave over her shoulder, and then uttered a final assurance, "See you later, Mr. Bell," and proceeded to walk away with a bit of a lilt in her step. Barton watched Megan as she continued to walk away, but shortly grew uncomfortable with his own spectating. Looking again at his watch, he was shocked but not particularly surprised at what it said. It was now almost 8:45. Mr. Howard was not going to be happy. As he reboarded the cab of his truck and fired up the engine, he uttered a brief prayer that he might be able to sneak into the store undetected and found thereafter sweeping or conducting some other boss-pleasing task. "Mr. Bell," Barton repeated to himself, repeating Megan's formal address to him from minutes before. I like the sound of that. It wasn't like he'd never been called Mr. Bell before, but it most certainly had never been called Mr. Bell by such a pretty young woman. Girl, oh my goodness, whatever she is, before. As he drove, Barton was very aware that his heart was beating quickly and his mind was a very distracted mess. Arriving at Howard Brothers Grocers, Barton bounded from his truck with his work apron and his name tag in one hand and closed the door with a flip of the other hand. About 10 steps away, he realized he'd forgotten to lock the truck's door. Turning on his heel, he made quick steps back to the truck cab, opened the driver's side door, pressed down the lock, then closed it again, this time with deliberation. As he did, he looked now over the hood of his own truck to see store owner manager Jake Howard pushing a cart of sacked groceries toward him for none other than Megan's mother, Sharon Flowers. "Oh, let me get those for you, ma'am. Mr. Howard, I can take those from here," Barton added, quickly moving to put his apron and name tag on. "No, Mr. Bell. I have Mrs. Flowers' groceries. Why don't you go inside and let me handle this? Oh, and I need to speak to you about something. Why don't you wait for me in my booth, okay?" Mr. Bell. Wow. Did hearing his boss speak his name so formally ever feel different from how he felt when Megan said it? Suddenly Barton was filled with dread and he was more than a bit nauseous. His arms and legs seemed to be filling with lead as he walked somberly toward the manager's booth office. For whatever reason, he found himself counting the steps as he ascended them and then realized upon reaching the top that he'd lost count along the way. "I am in so much trouble," Barton said to himself as he sat in the chair in front of the manager's desk. Very much alone and elevated above the shelves of the store, Barton looked up for a moment from his own anxiety and spied his manager now sacking groceries for yet another customer. He started to stand and rush down to relieve his boss from such menial work, but catching the start of the movement, Mr. Howard gave Barton a stern glance and shook his head no. Barton sat down again in his chair, filled all the more with dread. He waited there for a good 10 minutes until, at long last, Mr. Howard ascended the stairs to join him, speaking not a word until he had seated himself across the desk from his squirming employee. Barton, I'm very frustrated in your inability to be here on time each day. And this isn't the first time we've had this conversation, is it? In fact, this isn't the second or even the third time, is it? Barton's face burned with embarrassment, and he shook his head. No, sir, it isn't. I'm sorry. Jake Howard reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a neatly folded handkerchief, shook the folds from it, and then wiped the sweat from his own face before folding it once again and returning it to the same pocket. He then pulled a silver-toned pocket watch, this time from a vest pocket, opened the cover of it with a flick of a wrist, looked at it, and closed it with a press of a thumb, and then shoved it back into its place. Blast it, Barton. It's almost 9:05. I had to stand in your place and do your job for nigh on half an hour because you can't seem to get here on time. Believe it or not, son, I have other work to do, or were you not aware of that? Do you figure all I have to do is sit up here and twiddle my thumbs each day? Gesturing toward the cashiers, he continued. Do you figure that Mrs. Simmons has the time between checking the groceries of the customers that pass through her register to come up here and determine what needs to be ordered for the next shipment? Do you? Or is it in your mind that one of the boys from the meat market is actually who does payroll each week and makes sure that you have a check by Friday? Well, speak up, son. I'm growing weary of my own voice here. Barton felt like a small boy again. He tried to speak, but words were stacking up beneath his tongue and seemed to become hung on its tip. No, sir. I'm sorry, Mr. Howard. I won't let it happen again. Mr. Howard turned away for a moment and stared out of his store. For passing seconds, the air was filled only with the clatter of cash registers ringing up groceries, the music being piped over the store public address system, and the chatter of conversation being shared across the various register checkout counters. He shook his head and muttered something to himself Barton couldn't discern, then adding, not so quietly, "Blast it all." Then he turned to Barton and simply uttered, "Son, I need your name tag." Those words hit Barton like a bullet to his forehead. His mouth fell open, then he swallowed hard. What? No. Mr. Howard, please, no. I can do better. I promise. I will never be led again. Please, sir, just give me another chance. Jake Howard made no reply except to extend his right hand, reaching for Barton's name tag. Then he added, "The apron, too." The realization of what was happening came like an eclipse of the sun on Barton, causing everything that he knew and felt to suddenly become as dark as midnight. "Yes, sir," he replied, removing his Howard Brothers grocer's name tag from his shirt and then attempting to pull the loop of his apron over his head, forgetting a moment to untie the waist tie. Succeeding, he added, "Here you go," his voice quiet and laden with remorse. Barton stood to take the walk of shame down the store off his stairs, but stopped before making his departure. He cleared his throat, swallowed again, then added, "Mr. Howard, I'm sorry that I let you down, but I want you to know that I appreciate you giving me the chance to work for you these last 2 years. Thank you for letting me work here." And he extended his hand toward his former employer. Still very frustrated with the thought of having to fire the son of a personal friend, Mr. Howard started to ignore the gesture, but thought better of it. Grasping the young man's hand, he spoke. "Barton, you're a good boy and a hard worker. I truly hate to lose you, but I can't afford to keep you, not until you learn to be responsible for my interests, the interests of this store. I wish you well." With that, he shook Barton's hand firmly, then released it and turned toward his file cabinet, pretending to search for something needed. Barton stood there for only a moment, then turned descended the stairs, and proceeded to exit the store. As he was passing through the doors, a cashier called out in his direction, "Barton, carry out!" the signal for a sack boy to assist a customer. Barton paused for a moment, still holding the door open, then turned and replied apologetically, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I have to go." He then released the door, watched it close completely, and then walked toward his truck. Though he knew where he was going, he had a distinct feeling of being lost. Reaching his pickup, Barton opened the door and got in. As he closed the door, the sound of it struck him as being a very hollow thud that resonated for a moment before fading away. He put the key into the ignition and turned it, causing the well-worn engine to awaken. Barton sat for a moment listening to the engine's song, then placed his foot on the brake pedal, shifted the transmission into reverse, leaving the parking lot space and entering the street. Ceasing his reverse moment, he grasped the steering column, shift, and moved it 2 clicks to the right, placing his truck in drive. Now as he began to move forward to home, forward to having explained why he wasn't at work, forward to consequences. "Oh boy," he said under his breath. His parents weren't going to be pleased, and this was not going to be easy. "Well, Barton," he thought to himself, "how are you going to explain this?" Well, that's the end of chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Now I got to go get busy and finish chapter 3 so I can share that with you. In the meantime, God bless you. Know I love you, and I appreciate you for taking the time to listen. Bye-bye.